Well, welcome to the Native American language, commonly referred to as the NAL ED 2022 Grant Competition webinar. This is guidance for prospective applicants. We thank you for taking the time to join us today, and then we'll go ahead and play our standard disclaimer. Or I may just read it for us. So this presentation was produced under U.S. Department of Education contract number GS00F115CA with Synergy Enterprises, Inc. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred. All right. So a few logistical pieces for today. All of the participants are going to be muted today, but we do want your questions. So as we're going through, if you have any question, please post those over in the chat box. If you're looking for the chat box, typically it's at the bottom of your screen. Once at the bottom of your screen, you should see a little talk bubble that says chat under it, which will open the chat box. So post those throughout our time together today, and then throughout we'll pause and take those questions. This webinar recording and slide deck are going to be posted on the OESE website. So you'll be able to find that, and we'll give you a link to that later in our time together today. And if at any point you get disconnected or have any technical issues, please feel free to either message me here in the chat if it's a technical issue. You'll see I'm listed under OIETA team. Or if you get disconnected, email us at oie@seiservices.com. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our two presenters today, Dr. Donna Sabas-Burns and Angela Hernandez.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you everybody for taking the time to join us this afternoon or this morning, wherever you may be. There's a lot of material to cover for today's webinar, but I do want to remind everyone that there are two pre-application webinars for this program intended to help all the applicants to understand what applying for this competition involves. Neither of the two webinars is a substitute for thoroughly reading the notice inviting applications, or otherwise known as the NIA, and the application package in their entirety. So let's get started. And event overview. These are the topics that we will be discovering and exploring together. Objectives on who's joining us today, the purpose of this competition, the priorities, the application requirements and program requirements. We'll take a look at the selection criteria, look at some guidance for the budget information that needs to be submitted, along with the application package and instructions, post-application transmittal, and all kinds of resources for you. So see, it's a lot to go through. So let's get going. Today's events, we're going to be looking specifically at the FY22 NAL ED grant application package. We understand that the application and the program requirements, we're going to provide some in-depth insight into that. Also take a look at the selection criteria, understand what types of forms are required, and you'll also have some opportunities to submit questions to us as we go along. Next slide, Sarah.
So as we get started today, we'd like to know a little bit more about each of you. So I'm going to be popping up a poll about what type of entity you're here representing today. Are you representing an Indian tribe, a school operated by the Bureau of Indian Education, otherwise known as BIE, a tribal college or university, otherwise known as a TCU, an Alaska Native Regional Corporation as described in Section 3G of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, a tribal education agency or TEA, a private tribal or Alaska Native nonprofit organization, a local educational agency, an LEA, and that can include a public charter school that's an LEA under your state law, or a non-tribal for-profit organization. Or if none of those quite describe your entity, You can select none of the above, and we invite you to then share your entity in the chat box. And I see about 70% of us have been able to take the poll. I'll give you just a few more minutes or a few more seconds to be able to respond to that. Just selecting the one that best describes your entity. All right, we've got a few more.
Yeah.
All right, we've got most everybody responded, so I am going to go ahead and end the poll and share with you who's on with you today. You can see about a quarter of us are with an Indian tribe or a local educational agency. And then we have a good bit, about 12% that are a tribal college or university or a private tribal or Alaska Native nonprofit. And then a few from a BIE school or a tribal educational agency. We did have 6 who indicated none of the above. Remember, if you indicated none of the above, we really invite you to share in the chat box your entity so we can help you determine where you might best fit within this and eligibility. And then one other bit we'd like to know. So as we go to the next poll, we're curious, how did you learn about this grant competition? So I'm going to pop that one up. You might have seen it on our website. You may subscribe to our OAE listserv. Maybe you heard about it that way. Maybe you saw it on the Department of Ed grant forecast or saw the notice in the Federal Register. You might know a current NAL ED grantee and they gave you a heads up. Or maybe you are a current NAL ED grantee and looking to reapply, or again, other. And just like with the other one, if it's other, really curious how you heard about the grant competition. So please share that in the chat box as well. And so far, it looks like the majority of us heard about it from the OIE listserv, which is a great way to be able to keep up to date with what's going on at OIE, as is the OIE newsletter. And I see a good number who said other. I learned about it from an email forward. Lots of email forwards. So y'all know a lot of people who are in the know and they keep you in the know as well. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end this poll as well. And share, you can see 35% of us again from the OIE listserv, and then a good number from the OIE website and other. All right, well, thank you so much for sharing. If you didn't have the ability to respond to either of the polls, maybe it wasn't showing up on your device, remember you can pop any of that into the chat box. All right.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. We have a very good mix, so that's exciting to see. Okay, so before we jump into the content, this is just a reminder that this webinar represents just a portion of the required information that's available on this program. It is not 100% comprehensive. The best bet is to go directly to the notice inviting applications and the application package itself and just kind of look through the details and take each piece, pull it apart, and you'll find most questions will be answered right in those documents. So while we do and we will throw a lot of information at you, it is not 100%. And there's also a little reminder, which you'll see throughout, about instructions for grants.gov and the registration processes that are required for applying to this program. Next. So we will talk about the purpose, eligibility, and then the funding overview. Taking a look at the purpose of what we say NAL ED Program, and here is the program authority that describes everything you want to know how and why about NAL ED. There's also a link, and you will have copies of the slide deck, as well as a recording, which will be posted on our website, which we'll give you at the end. But here it looks at the final priorities of the program, definitions, selection criteria, everything about how and what about NAL ED can be found here in this program authority. And most of the information that we have in the slides, it actually comes from the ESEA and the Notice of Final Priorities. Next slide. The purposes of NAL are simple. They support schools that use Native American and Alaska Native languages as the primary language of instruction. We look to those to fund projects that maintain, they protect, revitalize, promote the rights and freedom of Native Americans and Alaska Natives to use, practice, maintain, and revitalize their languages as envisioned in the Native American Language Act of 1990, and also support the nation's First Peoples efforts to maintain and revitalize their languages and cultures, and to improve educational opportunities and student outcomes with Native American and Alaska Native communities. To be an eligible entity, and we'll break this down a little bit further on into the presentation, but the eligible entities include an Indian tribe, a TCU, tribal college or university, a TEA, which is a tribal education agency, an LEA, a local educational agency, and that does include public charter schools that are LEA under state law, a school operated by the BIE or Bureau of Indian Education, an Alaska Native Regional Corporation, a private tribal or Alaska Native nonprofit organization, or a non-tribal for-profit organization. And here's just a snapshot of the funding expectations. We were, I want to say, gifted an unexpected amount of a little over $1 million to provide we're estimating around three really great applications between the amount of $300,000 to $400,000. And this is estimated average. We're looking at an estimated average of $350,000 per grant. And here is a big change. Normally in the past, the NAL ED competitions and the grant program has funded 3 years. This particular project, we're going up to 5 years, up to 60 months, which is a big difference than what we've offered in the past. So that's something to keep in mind when you're planning out your budget. Again, we're expecting possibly funding around 3. We'll talk about the notice of intent to apply in just a second, but the big thing is to note on your calendar, the application deadline is Tuesday, August 2nd at 11:59 seconds. And we'll get into that deadline date and other details in a little bit. Next slide, please. So the notice of, oh, I'm sorry, this is Angela. Sorry.
No worries. Hi, everybody. The notice of intent to apply is just that. It's a notice of intent. We encourage you to use this and to apply and to submit your notice of intent via email to nal@ed.gov by the Tuesday, July 5th deadline. It's not required. So even if you're on the fence about applying and you're not positive, go ahead and submit that notice of intent anyway. That just helps us with our planning processes to make sure that we have the capacity to undertake the competition. We also ask, because it helps us to prepare for the right number of reviewers, there is no penalty or nothing wrong with you deciding you don't want to. So again, we would ask that you err on the side of doing so. When you submit an intent to apply, we also ask that you let us know the native language to be this central to your project. And if we go to the next slide, we can share a little bit more about why that's important. Trust me, we're going to go into many, many requirements that this application process has of you, but we wanted to start with the requirements that are actually expected of the department. So the program statute states that the department must adhere to 2 requirements. The first is diversity of languages, and that's asking us as the department in issuing the competition to ensure a diversity of languages. So that means that we would not fund more than 1 project in any competition year that proposes to use the same language, Native American language, assuming enough high quality applications. And in the event that there was a lack of high quality applications, we could choose to fund more than one project with the same Native American language. But if you look back at our prior cohorts, you will see that we had a diversity of languages, meaning one language. There were no languages repeated twice, if you will, across our awards in any given fiscal year. So even if you do go back and look at prior projects and they have a language that you're considering, please don't be dissuaded, because again, those were prior years and we're only talking about anybody who would apply in the same year as you. Geographic distribution is another requirement of us. So it is our job to ensure geographic diversity. And again, assuming there are enough high quality applications, we would not fund projects that all propose to serve students in the same state, again, in any competition year. So again, just in order to ensure, and because the funds are limited, making sure that we have both language and geographic representation. Next slide, please. And just briefly, you see our word cloud that gives you just a sense of the languages that we have currently supported through our FY18, which was our very first cohort for this program, and our FY20 grantees. They're pretty dispersed, as you can see. And again, you can find more information about those projects on our program pages, which we'll share in a bit. Next slide. I'm going to turn it back for the moment to Donna, who will start us back with the priorities.
Thank you, Angela. Okay, looking at the priorities, we have 2 absolute priorities and we have 2 competitive preference priorities. Next slide, please. So when we look at the absolute priorities for this FY 2022 competition and any other subsequent year in which we make awards from the list of unfunded applications from this competition, these priorities are absolute priorities. And under this Federal Code of Regulations, we consider only applications that meet either the absolute priority 1 or absolute priority 2. Next slide. Okay, so looking at absolute priority 1, it is to develop and maintain new Native American language programs. And to meet this priority, an applicant must propose to develop and maintain a Native American language instructional program that has the following components. It will support Native American language education and development for Native American students, as well as provide professional development for teachers and as appropriate staff and administration to strengthen the overall language and academic goals of the school or schools that will be served by the project. It must take place in a school, and it does not augment or replace a program of identical scope that was active in the last 3 years at the school to be served. And just as a note, as an applicant, you must, and you'll probably see this a reminder throughout, but you must clearly identify the specific absolute priority that is proposed in your project in the project abstract, and we'll get to that a little bit. But this is also true for absolute priority 2, which is to expand and improve existing Native American language programs. To meet this priority, an applicant must propose to improve and expand a Native American language instructional program that will improve and expand Native American language education and development for Native American students, as well as provide professional development for teachers and, as appropriate, staff and administrators to strengthen the overall language and academic goals of the schools or schools that will be served by the project. This also will continue to take place in a school, and within the past 3 years has been offered at the school to be served. Next slide. So, turning over to Angela.
So what this basically means, just to draw a very clear distinction between whether you would consider yourself as applying under absolute priority 1 versus absolute priority 2, is shown in these examples. So in the first example, An applicant that is proposing a new Navajo program for 8th graders in a school that has had no language program since at least 2019 would apply under absolute priority 1. Versus example 2, where an applicant that was proposing a new Navajo language program for 5th graders at a school where it already currently exists. So again, new versus existing, and new can include any entity that hasn't had a program for a number of years, at least 3 years per this example. Next slide. Moving on to the competitive preference priorities, competitive meaning that it's optional. So for this year and any subsequent year that we might fund from these, any unfunded applications, we would consider these to be competitive preference priorities. We award up to 7 points for competitive preference priority 1 or CPP 1, and an additional 5 points possibly to an application that meets CPP 2. And so that you can earn both theoretically, depending on the conditions that you meet. And the max, of course, is 12 points. Next slide. So starting with 1, competitive preference priority 1 is basically assigning up to 7 points, from 3 to 7 points, and I'll share the breakdown in the next slide, where either the lead applicant or a partner in the application, meaning in a consortium agreement with that lead partner, has proposed to use at least a proportion of formula grant funds that they receive under Title VI, and that they use it to help sustain the project after the conclusion of the grant period. So let's go to the next slide. And across the next slide, you will see an increasing number of points for proposed effort to use an increasing percentage of the Title VI formula funds for sustaining the project beyond the up to 5 years that you might be proposing for the project. And there is a timeline, for obtaining parent committee input and approval of this action. If necessary, you'll want to build that in. But again, it's up to 7 points for that. Next slide, please. If you look here, and we're going to come back to this quite a bit, and in excruciating detail later on, there are a number of assurances and requirements and forms that need to be filled out. And this is one of those, if you decide to apply for these competitive preference points under priority 1. Next slide, please. So going to CPP 2, that's preference for Indian applicants. So it's a yes or no. You either don't get any points or you get 5 points, meaning that the application is submitted by a tribe, Indian organization, BIE funded school, or a TCU that's eligible to participate in the program, and a consortium of entities that meets the requirements. So if you apply as a consortium application, and that consortium includes any of those entities just listed, you would also be considered to meet this priority. Next slide, please. So here is just the detail on the consortium agreement, that if you do decide to apply as a consortium, the consortium agreement must state that the members designate one member of the group to apply for the grant, so one entity among the many, detail the activities that each member plans to perform, and bind each member of the group to every statement and assurance, i.e. signed and dated, right, by authorizing reps of each entity in this consortium agreement. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. Next slide, please. So just at a glance, when we talk about these different priorities, you need to meet either AP1 or AP2, and you have to go and apply under one or the other, not both. And where should you discuss this, or where should you say that you're going to apply under one versus the other? In the abstract section. And of course, probably it's going to come up in the context of your narrative. For CPP 1, again, and CPP 2, these are both optional. again, if you're declaring and requesting consideration for these points, you should be talking about them in the abstract section at a minimum. And if you're proposing CPP1 points and asking for those, you need to complete that form that we just shared a screenshot of in part 6 of the application package. And we're going to talk about part 6 a lot, because that's where all those other attachments that are not your narrative or your abstract come in. Next slide, please. And Donna, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Great. And speaking of all these wonderful requirements, that's what we're hitting next. We'll dive into some of the general requirements, the Memorandum of Agreement, applicant engagement with Indian tribes and tribal organizations, as well as certification. And some of you may have actually already gone into download or looked at your application package. So if you have that handy and want to play along, you can have that by your side. You're welcome to do that. Now it's time to grab it. All right, next slide, this slide. Okay, application requirements. We're starting with this because there's a lot of them for this competition. And you're required to complete all of the general requirement forms that are presented to you here, in, as Angela said, in part 6 of the application. If you're looking at here, the general requirements on part 6, many application requirements, they are addressed by completing. They are provided to you in the application package. And these are, you'll be adding these attachments when you upload your application in grants.gov. And again, part 6, other attachments section. Next slide. One of the first ones we'll talk about is an application requirement, is an applicant information for NAL ED program. And here is attachment with assurances. And this, as it states, it provides information that must be provided under these requirements and contains a bunch of program assurances that you must sign by your authorized representative and when you time to submit. And I believe there's, if you click again, there you go. There's a picture of them for the general requirements of what they look like. You must fill out every piece and have it signed. Next slide. And to meet these general requirements, again, you must complete the form titled Attachment, Applicant Information for NAL ED Program Assurances, available in Part 6. We do emphasize this quite a bit, as you can tell, because some of these pieces are often overlooked and not uploaded, and they are required. So we really just want to bring it home as to the importance of making sure these are completed. And then some of the forms, again, that you will find is instructional language. The name, you must provide us with the name of the Native American or Alaska Native language to be used for instruction at your school, supported by the eligible entity. You also must provide us the number of students that will be served by the project and which grade level or levels of targeted students in the proposed project. Include instructional hours, and these are the number of hours of instruction per week and through one or more Native American or Alaska Native languages currently being provided to targeted students at the such schools, if any. You need to provide us whether a pre or post assessment of Native American language proficiency is available, and if not, the percentage of the grant funds that will be used for developing such an assessment. And of course, a program description. A description, and of course, this will be completed also in the context of your narrative, but it is a detailed description of how the eligible entity will support Native American language education and development and provide professional development for staff in order to strengthen the overall language and academic goals of the school or schools that will be served by the project. You want to ensure the implementation of rigorous academic content that prepares all students for college and career readiness and ensure that students progress towards meeting high-level fluency goals in the Native American language proposed. And also in the general requirements, the organizational information for each school included in the project, information regarding the school's organizational governance or affiliations, specifically information about the school's governing entity, whether it's a local educational agency, tribal educational agency or department, charter organization, private organization, or other governing entity. The school's accreditation status must be provided. Any partnerships with institution of higher eds and any indigenous language schooling and research cooperatives must be listed. And these general requirements, we talk about assurances. And again, in part 6, indicating that each school to be included in the project must have the following. The school is engaged in meeting state or tribally designated long-term goals for students as may be required by applicable state law, federal law, or tribal law. And the school provides assessments of students using the Native American or Alaska Native language of instruction where possible. Assurances that the qualification of all instructional and leadership personnel at such schools are sufficient to deliver high quality education through the Native American and Alaska Native language used in the school. And also assurances the school will collect and report to the public data relative to student achievement, and if appropriate, rates of high school graduation, career readiness, and enrollment into post-secondary education or workforce development programs of students who are enrolled in the school's program. And here is what that part looks like. Next slide. All right, for the memorandum of agreement, it's very important to note that the importance of the non-LEA entity having a memorandum of agreement that requires the district or BIE school to share their data for grant reporting purposes. It's important to remember. So when we talk about this conditional memorandum of agreement, any applicant that proposes to work with a partner to carry out the proposed project must include a signed and dated memorandum of agreement that describes the roles and responsibilities of each partner to participate in the grant. Again, for each entity who is involved as a partner must be assigned roles and responsibilities and sign and date the agreement. It includes a description of how each partner will implement the project according to timelines described in your application. The roles and responsibility of each partner related to ensuring the data necessary to report on what we call the GPRA indicators, which is the Government Performance and Results Act. And also the roles and responsibilities of each partner related to ensuring that Native American language instructors can be recruited, retained, and trained as appropriate in a timely manner. This memorandum of agreement, or MOA, must be signed within 4 months prior to the application deadline. And that's important. I know sometimes when these are uploaded, they've been used for years and years, but please pay attention to the date as they have to be signed no further than 4 months prior to the application deadline. And just another side note, the MOA should be a document that has been signed. Oh, I already said that, sorry. I was reading something else, sorry. Next slide. Okay, number 3, applicant engagement with Indian tribes and tribal organizations. All non-tribal applicants, you must engage with appropriate officials from tribe or tribes located in the area served by the project, or with a local tribal organization prior to submission of an application. So the engagement must provide for the opportunity for officials from tribes or tribal organizations to meaningfully and substantively contribute to the application. It's important to remember that non-tribal applicants must submit evidence of either tribal engagement or a letter of support from one or more of the tribe or tribal organizations involved. Now, this evidence can be part of the MOA required by the application requirement 2 we just went over, and or can be uploaded as a separate attachment. And it's just a note here, if an applicant is an effective LEA that is subject to ESEA section 8538, then the LEA is required to consult with the appropriate officials from the tribe or tribal organizations approved by the tribes. So be careful when you look at these requirements that you do look at the notes and the small print or anything posted on that. Just another addition, effective LEAs are those that have 50% or more of their student enrollment made up of Native American students, or received an Indian Education Formula Grant that Angela mentioned earlier under Title VI of the ESEA in previous fiscal years that exceeds 40,000. And that is referencing the ESE section 8538, just as a side note. Now, tribal certification. For this requirement, an applicant that is an LEA and including a public charter school that is an LEA under state law, a school operated by a BIE or a non-tribal for-profit or nonprofit organization must submit a certification from an entity described in application requirement 4A, containing the assurances described in application requirement 4B, which we just discussed. The certification must be from one of the following entities: on whose land the school or program is located, or that is an entity served by the school, or whose members as defined by that entity are served by the school. So you can look at a federally recognized Indian tribe or tribal organization, a TCU, an Alaska Native Regional Corporation or Alaska Native nonprofit organization, or Native Hawaiian organization. These certifications, they must state that the school or applicant organization has the capacity to provide education primarily through a Native American or an Alaska Native language, and are sufficient speakers of the target language at the school or available to be hired by the school or applicant organization. And this form looks like this. And there's all the information we just went over right there.
Thank you, Donna. While I let Donna catch her breath, we're going to take just a moment here. I'm going to pause, and Sarah and Alani, I might just ask if there's, I see one question I want to get to, but if there are any others that I missed that we want to call out, let me know. I'm looking at Dr. Mack's question. Thank you, Dr. Mack, for your question. The really simple answer right now, just for the sake of time, is it depends. And what it depends on is what you're calling a tribal K-6 immersion pilot is what kind of entity that is considered. So I don't know if that's considered, if it's something that's chartered by a tribe and therefore a tribal organization, or if it's a private. So I would ask that if you don't mind, we'll take this question, but if there are questions comparable to Dr. Mack's from other folks that are listening in today, send those to us at nal@ed.gov. And we can make sure that we help to answer the question correctly, because a lot of it depends on really what you are legally designated as. And that might be different from entity to entity. Okay. Let's go to the next slide, please.
Well, and
is there anything else, Sarah?
Yeah, you did have two questions. One super simple answer. The question was whether the two pre-application webinars would be the same. And yes, both are going to be exactly the same. So if you're attending today, the next one will have the exact same information. The other one being, can state education agencies apply? Are they eligible entities?
They are not listed as an eligible entity for the purposes of this program. And so I would go back to that list of eligible entities, and we'll come back to that later as we go through the rest of the webinar. But in brief, no is the simple answer. I did see another question that I do want to get to, and that was about the average amount of funding that you could request per year. So Donna spoke earlier to the fact that we have a little over $1 million available for this fiscal year. And so really what that translates into is that for this first year, you would have be applying for a certain pot of money. And we said at an average typically is about $350,000. Now that said, they're two very different priorities, you know, establishing a new program, establishing or building on an existing program, and the amount of funds and resources you need is really, you know, up to you, depending on the scope and scale that you're talking about building. So there is not technically a cap, but I think really being realistic, and we always use these terms ambitious but reasonable, right? So what you really want to be able to do, but also what you know you are going to be able to do. So if you know you have this plan to do something, but you have no staff yet, and it's going to take time to hire, the likelihood that you're going to need a salary for somebody for the entire year is probably unlikely. So, you know, it takes time, right? So I think factoring those things into your cost for that first year, subsequent years, you can be asking for more, you can be asking for less, as you know, you build up, whether it's existing or new, but just keep those things in mind and be practical about those approaches to make sure you're asking really for what you need. Can the language program emphasize funding future language teachers, including having them shadow or student teach during the 5 years? We'll get exactly to some of those issues. I think the short answer is yes, but we're going to get to some of those questions in the context of the selection criteria that Donna will talk about in a few moments. Okay, so I'm going to pause on those. Let's go to the next slide, program requirements. I'm going to just kind of run through these. These are more you must. And then we want to get to the good stuff about selection criteria. So this is a biggie because it's tied again to something that Donna talked about earlier. And that was about, you know, data, making sure that if you are a partner that's not the LEA or not the BIE funded school, that you make sure that you have that agreement, right? When you're talking about data and assessments, and that you're making sure that everybody's on the same page about what must be done as part of the program conditions. So grantees must administer pre and post assessments of Native American language proficiency to participating students. It can be in any relevant tool that, as you define, that measures Native American language proficiency, such as oral, written, or project-based assessments, and they can be formative or summative. So really, there's a lot of flexibility there in how you think about that. So I just want to be really clear. We're not talking about state proficiency tests. We're talking about the tests you define as being, you know, conducive and appropriate for what you are trying to instruct around. Next slide, please. So we wanted to share, just based on some of our past and current projects, what are some of the things that people are using? So some of the types of assessment include conversational assessments with a proficient educator or assessor, and that could include an elder. You could be paying that elder. Conversational and question-based assessment with elder of same gender, online multiple choice and spoken assessments, online assessments where students record their verbal responses to written and or audio prompts. And I think we've all become increasingly proficient in that type of delivery as a result of COVID and having to do that kind of instruction remotely. Means of determining proficiency. So thinking about what's grade level and or age or developmentally appropriate. What's the same scale for everybody, including adults, and looking at adapted versions of the ACTFL scale. So again, these are factors that we're aware of. It's up to you to define that against scope and scale, especially if it's new, if it's a new program, being ambitious but reasonable about what you can expect to develop in up to a 5-year period. Next slide. So as with many of our other programs in OIE, we have a statutory hiring preference that are primarily for the benefit of Indians and are subject to the provisions of Section 7B of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. So that says, to again, to the greatest extent possible, giving to Indians preferences and opportunities for training and employment in connection with the administration of the grant, as well as giving to Indian organizations and to Indian-owned economic enterprises as defined in Section 3 of the Indian Financing Act of '74, preference in the award of contracts in connection with the administration of the grant. And again, for the purposes of this section, an Indian is a member of any federally recognized Indian tribe. Next slide. So data. Besides your own proficiency assessments of proficiency that we just talked about, this program does have GPRA measures, or Government Performance Result Act measures. They are the indicators that we use to determine the success of the program. But again, there's some flexibility sort of embedded in these, and I'll talk about this in a second. Really, again, what are you thinking about? What can be measured? What's the right indicator? What's appropriate? It's not, it's not anything truly robust. It has to be within the confines of what's reasonable for what you're doing. And you'll be expected to report on these annually and in your final performance report. Let's go to the next slide and I'll show you what those are. So there are 4 measures. The first is the number and percentage of participating students who attain proficiency in a native language as determined by each grantee, again, through the assessments that you have proposed to use and or develop. Measure 2, the number and percentage of participating students who make progress in learning a native language as determined by each grantee through pre and post session assessments of native language proficiency. Number 3, the number and percentage of participating students who show an improvement in academic outcomes as measured by academic assessments or other indicators. Here's what that means. That means, and you can identify another academic assessment, again, could be state proficiency, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a classroom-based, a school-based, district-based formative assessment. You could be using that, but you're using another existing measure in order to measure that particular indicator. And then 4, the difference between the average daily attendance of participating students and the average daily attendance of all students in the comparison group. So here we're telling you our logic model is that we know that greater engagement of Native students can happen when we offer culturally relevant instruction like native language. And so this is going to require you to be able to take attendance data from the participating schools back to the importance of those consortium agreements to make sure that data sharing agreements are in place. Next slide. And Donna, maybe we go through these and then we'll pause for questions.
I agree. Okay. And here are the selection criteria. This is what you will be scored on. So this is obviously very important to go over in depth as we can. Again, these are criteria from the NFP Notice of Final Priorities and the 34 CFR 75210. There's 5 total selection criteria with a number of sub-criteria below them, each one, and it adds up to a score of 100, just to let you know. Next slide. Okay, so this slide is strictly advisory only. This is to show each selection criteria and its sub-criteria have points assigned, okay? And when we look at, or when the peer reviewer who scores your application, the reviewers, they'll be asked to consider these ranges and as a guide to awarding points to your selection criteria. So for example, if you have a selection criteria with a total of 3 points, the reader peer reviewer can either 0, was it there or not, all the way up to giving you a 3 and anywhere in between. And that goes for if it's 9 points, it could be anywhere in between 0 to 9 with low scores, medium scores, and high scores. This is just advisory only, just so you can see when we have the peer reviewers score, that's what they kind of use as a way of helping them score. Next slide. So the first one, of course, is the quality of the project design. And you're looking for a total of 32 points for this entire section, looking at the extent to which the goals, objectives, and outcomes to be achieved by the project are clearly specified and measurable. I have sat in on panels where the readers have struggled to find these, or they're not measurable, and that's an easy way to lose points. So just make sure that they're clearly specified and measurable. The extent to which all students progress towards grade level development appropriate fluency in the Native American language being proposed. The extent to which the proposed project will incorporate parent engagement and participation in the NAL instruction. Quality of the approach, and that was 6 points, by the way. Quality of the approach for developing and administrating those pre and post assessments we discussed of the NAL proficiency, including consultation with individuals with assessment expertise. That is 6 points. And then for 5 points, the extent to which the performance feedback and continuous improvement are integral to the design of the proposed project. That is for 5 points, totaling 32 points for the project design. Just as a side note, as a reminder too, we mentioned absolute priority 1 and absolute priority 2. We will be presenting slates, two separate slates, one for the absolute priority 1 of new programs and one for the second one, existing programs seeking to expand the native language. So there'll be 2 separate slates out of this. Next slide. Apologize for the small fonts. This is project services, and it's for 29 points. And there are 5 sub-criteria under this, this selection criteria. You're looking at the quality and sufficiency of the strategies for using equal access and treatment for eligible project participants. And these are members of groups who have traditionally been underrepresented based on race, color, national origin, gender, age, or disability. That's an easy 1 point. Make sure it's there. If not, of course, 0. 11 points. The quality of the plan for supporting grade level and developmentally appropriate instruction to the NAL by providing instruction of or through the Native American language. The extent to which the project will provide professional development we talked about for teachers and as appropriate staff and administrators to strengthen the overall proficiency of the language and the goals, academic goals of the schools. And these will be served by the project, including cultural competence training for all staff. That's 10 points. The extent to which the services to be provided by the proposed project involve the collaboration of appropriate partners for maximizing the effectiveness of project services for 4 points. And then the 5th one for this one for 3 points is the percentage of the school day that instruction will be provided in the Native American language is ambitious and is reasonable for the grade level and population to be served. The next one is very important as well, the quality of the project personnel. So when we're looking at project personnel, there are 3 sub-criteria here for 16 points total. And we're looking where, which the applicant, they encourage applications for employment from persons who are members of groups that have traditionally been underrepresented. And like we discussed earlier, based on race, color, national origin, gender, age, or disability. The second one is the extent to which the teachers of the Native American language who are identified as staff for this project have teaching experience and are fluent in the proposed Native American language for 9 points. And then for 6 points, qualifications, including some of the relevant training and experiences of the key project personnel, meaning the project director, the qualifications of project coordinators, or the key personnel of the grant that proposed. Oops. And then when we look at adequacy of resources for a total of 10 points, we're looking for 2 things. The extent to which these costs are reasonable in relation to the objectives and the design and the potential significance of the proposed project. So you want to make sure those align with your objectives, the cost, and the potential for continued support of the project after federal funding ends, including as appropriate, the demonstrated commitment of appropriate entities to such support. So you want to see the sustainability after the grant ends, what the plan is. That's for 4 points. And then the last one is the quality of the overall management plan. And this is 13 points. And we're looking at the adequacy of the management plan to achieve the objectives of the proposed project on time and within budget, including clearly defined responsibilities and timelines and milestones for accomplishing the project tasks. And that is 8 points. And then lastly, the extent to which the time commitments of the project director and principal investigator and any other key project personnel are appropriate and adequate to meet the objectives of the proposed project. And that is for 5 points. Phew, that was a lot. So we'll stop here. Any questions?
Actually, Donna, I'm going to keep us going.
All right.
Because of all the data we have to share, and I'm going to attempt to be answering questions that are coming up as we go. If we miss them this time again, I implore you, please send your message or question to NAL@ed.gov, and we'll be sure to get to it if we run out of time today. But I want to spend some time walking through the budget and just really highlight a couple of points about the budget, specifically around indirect cost and that administrative cap requirement. Let's go to the next slide. So the ED 524 form, we're going to show it again in a little bit, so I'll come back to that. Let's go to the next slide. What I will say is the 524 form is literally a chart where you're just showing the quantities by federal budget category and by year. You want to make sure that whatever you put in that form is matching your budget narrative. You want to give an itemized budget breakdown in your narrative for each year of the proposed project. And again, it's up to 60 months. What's the difference, Armand, if I'm understanding your question correctly? 3 years was the cap of this program for the last couple of cycles. Congress expanded it to 5 years, meaning up to 60 months. So now you can ask for up to 5 years worth of funding. So that's the key difference between this and prior competition years. If you want to ask for only 3 still, go for it. There's no difference. It's all measured and judged on their own merit. So there's no comparison or better or wrong answer, but just know that you do have the opportunity. And this was really in response to, I think, a lot of feedback that Congress is probably getting around the importance of more support because language programs take a long time to start up. Review and edit those forms. Again, just make sure that they match. A lot of folks try to kind of play around with this stuff at the last minute, and then there's a mismatch, and that spells possible reductions in the final grant because they don't match. So make sure those things match your narrative versus your actual form. Indirect costs, next slide. So here's what I'll say about indirect cost. Make sure that if you have an indirect cost rate agreement, you are putting that agreement, even if it's going to expire at the end of September, put that agreement in your application, tribes, primarily LEAs, etc. Make sure you're putting that rate agreement in there. It's not just enough to say you're asking for it in your narrative. You have to include the agreement so that you can get that credit. Next slide, please. And yes, if you weren't sure if you have one or you need one, that prior slide, which you'll get a copy of this slide deck, you can certainly contact our indirect cost rate office for more guidance on how to get that. Let's talk a little bit about the admin cap. So many of you familiar with federal grants know that a lot have administrative cost cap. This is no different. We say that no more than 5% of the funds awarded under the program can be used for administrative purposes. That's for the entire grant, right? So 5% of the, meaning all 5 years of the grant. Let's go to the next slide. some people are like, well, what does that mean? So I just wanted to kind of highlight what that tends to mean. Direct administrative costs may include, program management, whatever it takes for your PD, your project director, your executive director to manage the work. Preparing program plans or budget schedule. Again, the organizational and operational aspects of the work is what you would consider administrative related costs. Monitoring the programs, filling out the annual performance reports, the final performance report, divisional level administrative purposes, accounting or legal activities, anything like that associated with this grant would be administrative costs. Let's go to the next slide. An example of non-labor direct costs for the administration would include costs for goods and services, like including the rental or purchase of equipment, utility, office supplies, postage. Let's go to the next slide. So here's really what I want to be able to show you, because these tend to be some of the more relevant types of activities and costs associated with this program. So again, just as an example, these are just discrete examples. If the time that the project director takes to complete personnel evaluations, that's in a direct administrative costs. But if your project director, it's a small shop, not a lot of capacity, and that project director, by the way, is the program lead for your professional development of your native language instructors, that's a program cost. So again, distinguishing, right? Actually carrying out aspects of the project, of the substantive portions of the project, that's program cost. The cost for renting a community space for an elder facilitated event, that's a direct administrative cost. But financial accounting activities, likely an indirect cost. It's something built into the indirect cost rate, right? And then finally, the time that, again, the APR to get it filled out or other program requirements, administrative costs. So this is not at all comprehensive. It's just meant to give you just an initial guide for how to think about that distinction. And again, 5% cap is that direct administrative cost limit. Next slide, please. So let's go to the application package itself. And I want to circle back to something I shared in the chat. Thank you. And I can't remember the name of the individual who said, I can't find this. Well, if you go to the grants.gov link that they shared right now in the chat that our TA team shared, it'll take you to the page of grants.gov where you'll see blue URL links to all of the standard forms, right? So those are all the really unfriendly looking federal forms that we make you fill out as part of the application. But in addition to that, there's a button there that says download instructions. And that download instructions button is where you pull down what we call the application package instructions. And so a lot of what we're going to be walking through and have been walking through is in that package. Thank you, TA team. And we're going to walk through some of those package elements with the intent of helping you navigate all of the forms that you're going to have to fill out for this application. So Donna, can I turn it over to you?
Sure. Okay, that's the grant opportunity number, which grants.gov will identify in yellow. That's the number you use. Next slide, please. All right, taking a look, these are the total of 7 parts of the application. You have, and we'll go a little bit through each one. Preliminary documents, your budget information, your abstract, the project narrative attachment, the budget, the other attachments that we've hit on quite a bit, and the assurances and certifications as well. Next slide. So the preliminary documents with part 1, you'll see Form SF424 in your Ed supplementary information are important. Make sure you take a look at these and refer to the instructions in the application for guidance on how to fill these out. Next slide.
Okay, I'll take this, Donna. This is, again, the standard form I was referring to earlier and talking about the budget, the Ed 524. So you see 1 column for every given project year. Make sure you're only filling out up to 5. Do not fill out that 6 and 7. That's not good because it's only up to 5 years. You can fill out less. The bottom section includes a question. You probably can't see it. It's so tiny down there, that asks about indirect cost. Again, answer it there. That's great, but make sure you're including that indirect cost rate agreement that you receive from your authorizing entity. And usually, I know for tribes, tribal orgs, this is the Department of Interior. For higher ed institutions, it's us. Next slide, please. Real quick tip on that, completing that 524, complete the entire form. Again, check that to make sure that they match, the figures match what's in your budget narrative. If you're not sure if something's allowable, consult uniform guidance and applicable regulations. And I'll ask if you guys, TA team, if you can put a link to CFR 200 in there for folks. Here's a big common one, which is just a real common question in general, is that supplies versus equipment. So again, really supplies are anything that are under 5,000, and equipment is 5,000 or over. Okay, so supplies meaning a single unit. If you were buying, if you were requesting 20 iPads for your classroom for language proficiency assessments that need to be taken electronically, then you're asking for, what is 300 per unit or so. I don't know what they are these days, but I'm going to make it up and say 300. And that's definitely supply. So it would have to be a pretty significant thing to be equipment. And we don't expect necessarily that we would see equipment in these costs. Next slide. Donna, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Okay, the abstract. While this is a small piece of the overall application package, it's very important as it has a total of, there's 10 items here that we really want you to focus on. This piece will be posted on our webpage, highlighting those that are awarded. So we do ask for specific information. So please make sure as you're writing that up that you refer back to this slide in particular, or any of the other resources that talk about the items there. So I won't go through each one. It's pretty self-explanatory what is included, but just make sure that it's complete part of your application. Next slide. And just talking about the project narrative, you're looking at, we recommended a 30-page limit. This doesn't mean you have to do that under 30 pages or less. It can be more, but we ask to keep in mind when the peer reviewers are scoring your application, if they're having to go through a 100-page document, which I've seen, it's cumbersome. And they have several to go through. And so just keep that in mind, that we recommend about a 30-page narrative, okay? We also recommend some of the following standards that are listed. Again, it doesn't mean your application will be thrown out. It just means that these are recommended standards and fonts to use within your project narrative. And as it says, it will not be disqualified if it doesn't meet some of these recommendations, okay? Next slide. And Angela talked about the budget. Well, this part is the budget narrative, which is part 5. And it talks about allowable, allocable, and reasonable costs. And looking at these narratives, requires an itemized budget breakdown. So while you have the budget form that we showed you, you also have the narrative that should match that along, and it should be adequate and match your goals and objectives of the project. And I'm going to read this out loud. The applicant should provide sufficient detail to enable reviewers and project staff to understand how requested funds will be used, how much will be expended, and the relationship between the requested funds and the project activities and outcomes. They must match. It must make sense, not only to the people who are reviewing, but once we get the grant and first thing we do is look at the budget for these allowable items. Does it make sense to what you're proposing in your project? And I saw that they put the cost principles in there. Thank you, that you can check for those allowable costs if you question them. Next slide. And this part 6, my favorite, required of all applicants that we went over in detail in the beginning. And it talks about all the information, the assurances. Please, please, please make sure that you complete these and upload them as part of your application and assurances. As you can see, we've hit this quite a bit, and because they're very specific form, and it's required of all applicants. Next slide. And also, to keep it going, because I can't say it enough, we have the memorandum of agreement and the engagement with tribes, Indian tribes and tribal orgs, and the tribal certification, all of the indirect cost rate agreements and the documentation, all of those things, they go here in part 6 if it is applicable. We've shared a number of documents that may be required, but remember, depending on your entity, the type of the lead applicant, these various documents, they need to be included as part of your application. Okay, Angela, I'm turning it over to you.
Yeah, and before I begin, Sarah, can you remind folks about how they're going to get a copy of this slide deck?
Yes, I absolutely can. So you will be able to get a copy of the slide deck as well as access a recording of this entire webinar on the OIE webpage, and I'll put a link to that over in the chat just now.
Thank you, Sarah. And one of the reasons, besides thank you, Bernard, for raising this, for asking that question, is because as we get into this next set of slides, which are so much fun, really, we had these slides developed with the idea in mind of just tell me what I need to fill out. And so really thinking about this, we're going to be walking through in a series of slides that are going to describe by entity what you need to complete and what you might want to or need to complete depending on the types of options you choose for this application. So I'm going to divide first everybody up into sort of tribal versus non-tribal, because there are a series of things specific to tribal and, more importantly, non-tribal that aren't necessarily one and the same. So by tribal entities, of course, we mean tribe, TCU, TEA, Alaska Native Regional Corp, and private tribal or Alaska Native nonprofit org. Versus non-tribal, a non-tribal for-profit organization, a BIE school, funded school, and an LEA, including a public charter school that is an LEA under state law. Let's go to the next slide. So part 6, documentation required specifically for tribes. So again, this is only specific to that part 6 section, because we talked about all of those other sort of standard forms, those template forms. Everybody's got to fill that out. Everybody's got to fill out the general application requirement that Donna just spoke to. General application requirement, attachment, and assurances. And that's what you do. The other thing to note in this slide, as we say under that first document, 01, is it's got to be signed and dated by the authorizing representative. This is critical. So these slides also highlight when things have to be signed, where you can find the forms, or if you're creating them yourself. So again, with this general application, it's the slide we showed you, it's the form we showed you that's in that application, that download instructions document. And it does need to be signed and dated by the authorizing rep of the application. MOA is short for a memorandum of agreement, or we've been referring to this also as consortium, okay, agreement. So just to be clear, memorandum of agreement or a consortium agreement is one and the same. It's applicant generated, meaning you're creating that MOA, and it's to be signed and dated by the authorizing representative of each partner entity. So if there are 5 partners and only 2 of them sign it, that consortium agreement is only as good as the 2 partners' roles and responsibilities who signed it. Okay, so make sure everybody is signing and dating. Then if you decide, tribal lead entity, to apply and ask for consideration for the competitive preference priority Title VI funding, there's that form again in that application package. It does not require a signature, but the participating school or LEA will need to complete it because it's going to be specific to their formula grant that they probably have all of the information for. So you will need their help in completing it. Next slide. So if you are a TCU and you are applying for this, again, just like everybody else, general application. If you have a partner, and likely will, because you're going to need a school, then it's applicant generated. Again, you're creating that consortium agreement to be signed and dated by all authorizing reps of all partners. And similarly, a competitive preference priority 1 or Title VI funding, if that school has a Title VI grant and has committed as your partner to attributing at least 20%, if not more, of their Title VI funds after the project has ended, then yes, you'll need their help in filling that out. No signature, but they have to help you complete it. Next slide. If you're a TEA, again, similarly, general application, you create the memorandum of agreement with partners as appropriate, if you decide to have them. And if you are choosing competitive preference priority 1, Title VI funding, again, you'll need to get the help of the school or LEA that you are partnering with to complete that form. Next slide. Documentation of Alaska Native Regional Corps. Again, I'm going to just say all the same things that we just described here. Next slide. And finally, documentation required of a private, tribal, or Alaska Native nonprofit organization. So general requirements, memorandum of agreement, if you have partners, and CPP Title VI funding, the forms in the package, and you need to work with that participating school or LEA partner. Now, for all of the entities I just described, just walk through, you also can say in your abstract that you're applying for competitive preference priority 2, which means if you are the lead entity and you are an Indian org or TCU, etc., that you would qualify for those competitive preference priority 2 points. Okay. And you just state that in your abstract. Now we're moving now to non-tribal. And this is where the work gets heavy, as you can see from the slide. So like the others, general application, memorandum of agreement with partners, said partners, and this memorandum of agreement or consortium agreement, right, that we're talking about is for any partners that are going to work with you. The applicant engagement with tribal officials, that's document 3 there, 03. That's also something you generate. So that might be a letter of support, again, from them, or evidence of tribal consultation, an agenda, for example, some evidence that you have engaged with tribal officials. And we do not define that. That's something you can specify, but any kind of documentary evidence. Tribal certification, that form is in that application package in that Part 6 section. And yes, it must be signed and dated by the tribal official or a tribal official. And then same thing, competitive preference priority 1, Title VI funds. If you are partnering with an LEA or school that wants to devote some of their Title VI formula funds to the work after the project is finished. And then CPP2, and this is important to note here. It's basically the consortium agreement. If you have a tribe or TCU or BIE funded school that is partnering with you, or it's a tribal entity that is a member of the consortium per the signed consortium agreement. And what do we mean by that? Back to that second document, MOA, consortium agreement, memorandum of agreement, one and the same, can be the same document that you're using to declare both for the purposes of having a partner, as well as if it includes an Indian entity as defined in this notice inviting applications, it can also be serving as that declaration for requesting competitive preference priority 2. Okay, next slide. Documentation required of a school operated by BIE. So not just BIE funded, but BIE operated, right? So general application requirements, same thing, MOA or consortium agreement. And again, looking, depending on who you are, which entity you are, make sure you read the entire column, because some of these require signature. Some of them are already in the package for you to complete, and some things like the applicant engagement with tribal officials, the consortium agreements, need to be generated by you, created by you. And then of course, tribal certification, competitive preference priority, documentation. I won't go through those again. We've gone through them already. Let's go to the next slide. This is public charter school. Again, pretty much all of the same types of documents, many more signatures. And really here again, the key is really that partnering and having on board tribal representation in some shape or form. And you'll see that just by virtue of what we're asking for here. These are critical to include. To not include these means you're not meeting an application requirement, except for the competitive preference priority points. These first four are really critical. Next slide. And of course, you can choose other attachments to include to help address or respond to the selection criteria, like individual resumes for project directors and key personnel. We mentioned the copy of the indirect cost rate agreement, which would be critical. And please make sure, I'll just say just the mechanics of applying, that you're reading the guidance from grants.gov about the right format to put this in and how to name files to make sure you don't have any problem getting these files through. Let's go to the next slide.
Okay, that's me. Insurances in part 7, we talked about the insurances and certifications. Just a reminder, there's several other forms that need to be included. Your the SF424B form, disclosure of lobbying, your certification regarding lobbying, and your GEPA requirements are all part of the application package. Next slide. Under applications for grants under this program, it must be submitted electronically using grants.gov to apply. And we posted that in the chat box. You will be able to download a copy of this package, complete it offline, and then upload it with all of those attachments that were discussed. Please do not mail an electronic copy of the application to us. Remember, it must be fully uploaded and submitted no later than 11:59 p.m. Eastern time on the application deadline. They are very, the grants.gov literally shuts it down. So there is no way to upload anything after that time. So please be cognizant of the time frame. You have registration of several things. The primary information about the SAM is available at www.sam.gov. You have lots of different resources to help you understand what the UEI number and the TIN and the SAM and all these lovely acronyms that we love to use. And there is a link to the Apply SAM FAQs if you need, and a UEI unique entity identifier is what it's called, fact sheet, that is also available, that's needed when you register. So please read through these application submission instructions. Next slide. If you have any kinds of grants.gov submission problems, please do not contact the competition manager nor Angela. We will not be able to help you. You must go to either the email, the phone, the web portal, lots of ways to help get that done, but please do it early so you're not running against many other grant competitions that are also going on within the department, and also people who may be applying for this one. So there's a resource slide for you. Next slide.
So at this point, Sarah, I'm just going to ask, I'm going to leave this slide up for a minute. Well, just want to see if there are any burning questions. Folks can read what's on the slide.
So I would say most of the questions that are in the chat do kind of pertain to specific applicants. So I'm going to encourage everyone to send those in to the NAL@ed.gov, and I'll put that in the chat again. And that way we can go through the last couple of slides.
Okay. So I'm going to move past these tips. Again, you'll have a copy of this slide deck, but what we're sharing in here is certainly what you'll see in grants.gov and in our application package and common instructions. Underscoring, don't wait until the last minute. Make certain that all required forms and signatures are included in your application. Submitting the form and forgetting a signature is not going to be a good thing. Next slide, please.
So these just 2 quick slides talking about the eligibility screening and peer review paneling as just as an FYI. Next slide, please. Knowing that they will be screened for eligibility by peer reviewers. If you are unsuccessful, you will receive a letter as well as TRFs, which is the review forms that are used for screening with all the strengths and weaknesses from the peer reviewers. You will be, as a courtesy, we do provide that to you. And all eligible applications will be reviewed by the peer reviewer. Next slide. They are independently read and scored by 3 qualified peer reviewers. They have a panel discussion. And then there's a compressed window, a review window, and this helps the reviewers with clear applications in that the process for this competition. Next slide.
So we've got, as Sarah mentioned before, an upcoming webinar, identical information being delivered, not new. So if you don't want to be tortured, go through this one more time, feel free to just access the recording that Sarah talked about earlier that will be posted on our program pages in the next day or 2. Those will all be available on the webpage, and any updates, again, for the program will be posted there, to include proposed languages and geographic locations from prospective applicants. So we need you to submit those intents to apply. Note which language you're considering. Again, we can post those on our website in order for you to be aware of others who may be applying and may even be a potential partner as opposed to a competitor in the application process. So just know that that will be there to the extent that you are willing and able to share that information in advance. Next slide. Sarah, you want to say anything about this?
The only thing to say about this is, can you please complete this really quick survey? So I'm going to pop up on the screen a really quick feedback poll. It takes less than a minute, maybe a minute and a half if you're casually clicking. So it's super, super fast, but it's very helpful in us as we prepare webinars for everyone, whether it be for these applications or for grantees. So if you don't mind responding to that, I'll leave that up for you as we go to our final slide with the important contact information. So remember, if you're sending in your notice of intent to apply or any of the application questions, those that you've put in the chat that we weren't able to get to today, or those that you think of as you're going through the application process, please email those in to nal@ed.gov. You'll also see the link there to the web page. When you go on the OIE web page, you'll see here, this is the main page for the NAL ED grant. When you go along the right side, there is a little option for how to apply, and that's directly where any updates to this will occur, including the posting of the slide deck and of the recording within 48 hours.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. That concludes this pre-application webinar.